more Ridge Stories. It's my original book there. I'm Harry Jones. I'm happy to be in this. I'm happy to be here with you, and I'm also happy to have driven by Madison. I have good memories of Madison in 1970. Looks like many of you can remember 1970. I was discharged from the Army at Fort Bliss, Texas, and after being a fairly respectable soldier, I came to Madison, and it was a relief. I no longer had to get my hair cut, and one of the first things that we did was to buy tickets to a road show of the musical Hair. And it had meaning for me. Well, some of you are familiar, perhaps, with my Ridge Stories for the Hens, Pottering Pigs, and other recollections of a boyhood in the Driftless. But like old men everywhere, I'm sure including you guys, I have lots of stories, many, many stories, and I continue to collect them in manuscript form. Under the working title, More Ridge Stories. If the Wisconsin Historical Society Press ever decides to bring out a sequel to my book, they'll probably come up with something better, like they did there. Maybe something like Stuck on a Big Hill, or that sounds fairly good, I think. Well, this afternoon, what I plan to do is to give you a pictorial introduction to the Pleasant Ridge, my Pleasant Ridge, of the 1940s and 50s. I will read to you some stories, or share with you some stories that are not in this book. I'll tell you some stories, and we'll do all this in about a half hour's time. If you have questions to ask me, then I'm happy to answer them. And there's a good chance that some of you might have some stories that you can share as well. I'm curious, how many of you have a connection with farms? Oh, that's good. That's very good. You might find this kind of interesting. If you are interested in a copy of that, my wife can sell you some of those if you'd like. If you decide later, you can get anything at Amazon.com, including my books. So that's available. Now, if you're interested in finding my Pleasant Ridge, here's how you go about doing it. Go to Madison, you take Highway 14 north to Richland Center, keep going on Highway 80, and when you're about 8 miles out of town, you turn right on County D. When you top the second hill, pause on your left. There's a house where I was raised. If you come to the Evangelical United Brethren Pleasant Ridge Church, you've gone too far. You have to turn back to find out where you are. But this afternoon, you can visit that area as an armchair traveler. So I have some slides that I will share with you here. So we'll make this work. I'm the boy standing on the tractor wheel. OSHA probably wouldn't like that, huh? And that is my father who's standing behind that. That is an aerial view of the farm where I was raised, circa 1955, probably. Most farm boys. Whoa!
What was that?
The speaker overhead creates a feedback.
Okay, thank you. I'll move again if need be. I'll try not to trip on this. At any rate, most farm boys my age had a dog named Ted. Some of you maybe as well. And if you have an orange cat, its name had to be Tom. My father was very happy to get that tractor, hence the family photograph of that. He didn't like horses. He one time broke his hand striking back at a horse he was angry at. That's my uncle, my Uncle Vern, and that's when he was in the service, and my father is holding me. That's Granny Jones and me. We didn't have a real fancy house on the ridge at that time. It's been torn down since. That's Grant, and he is holding me. You can see from the frown on my face that my grandfather and I never always got along well. Usually did better with my granny. Here I am on the tractor, smiling. I would have preferred a horse. I never fit well into a farmer's boots. I'll find a place here yet. I never fit well into a farmer's boots, but I liked to garden. Still do. That is I was in the second grade then, the Pleasant Ridge one-room school. All 10 of us. I'm the boy in the bib overalls. Daryl Fairbrother, it was probably his second year of teaching, was our teacher. Those of you who spent lives in the country know how everything is connected. Daryl Fairbrother, my teacher's elementary teacher, was my mother, who was also a teacher. What had happened when I was when we were burying my father in Pleasant Ridge Cemetery in the interment, this short old man came up to me and quietly spoke, and I didn't know who he was at first. And he said, "I'm Daryl Fairbrother." And it was my teacher. It was a very touching moment, and the really good thing about that is only a few years ago, he passed away, and I connected with his daughter, who is also a teacher. So that was really sweet. My father was very good at stacking hay and straw. He was oftentimes called upon to do that. My mother was Raspberry Queen of the Ridge unofficially. And at that time, if you wanted to buy a quart of strawberries, they would set you back 50 cents. We don't get deals like that good. Piggly Wiggly store. Being ever so humble, there's no place like home. My parents, and that's my younger sister, died. I was very proud of that bicycle. I actually paid for it myself. Here I am high on the hog, literally. Our hogs were not very wild critters. The hardest part of mowing lawn was getting the used lawnmower that my father always thought he could fix and make wonderful. Getting that started. Here I am showing a pig at the fair. I have to explain part of the subtitle about powdering pigs. That's a Duroc hog, as I'm sure you all know. One year I had a Landress hog. You know, Landress hogs are white. And they're long-legged and they can just run like deer. But at any rate, I was told before I showed the pig, this white pig, that if I dusted her with talcum powder, she would show off better. So that's where the powdering pigs comes from.
And it smelled nice.
What's that?
And it smelled nice.
It did, I'm sure it did. Which was important to a hog. I persuaded my father to buy a sheep, thinking that it would be, I would have less lawn to mow, just let the sheep eat the grass. That didn't work well. The sheep liked raspberry bushes better than grass, and my mother was not happy. That is Maribel, our favorite cow. If you look at her, you can see she's just a wee bit beyond her prime. But she was such a fine, lovely cow. We couldn't get rid of her. She was kind of semi-pet. There I am, graduating from the 8th grade. You remember the picture of my grand? He was kind of a little guy, and we wore the same size shoes. He thought, there's no use in buying that boy a new pair of shoes. He's going to outgrow them anyway. He can wear mine. And I did. And there I am. graduating from high school, ready to head off to the University of Wisconsin at, what was it, the Wisconsin State Teachers College and Institute of Technology, it was called then. A very shy, awkward, homesick boy. And that is pretty much it. I'll go back to this picture here. There. There we go. Now, moving right on here. I mentioned the Mick Hill. Well, when my wife and kids and I, during the 1970s, would drive up the Mick Hill to visit my parents on the farm, my wife was sitting right there, and I should tell you, between her two cousins, Diane and Sandy, they'll come to hear me, and I appreciate that. Anyway, as we were driving up the hill, she would sigh and shake her head, and she would say, "Oh, this is a long, long way from Milwaukee." and it was. Our life in that city's densely populated east side was a little bit different than the open, rolling hills, the ridge top where I grew up, admittedly a hillbilly. Well, Pleasant Ridge is located between Lloyd and Rockbridge, for those of you that know that particular area. There are no rolling plains, fruited or otherwise, that characterize that driftless area of Wisconsin. Fruit trees typically were raised on hilltops, and some of you probably know why that is. It's because the blossom freezes of spring settle into the valleys rather than killing the fruit blossoms. At any rate, from those ridges of blue skies that appear especially spacious, and hills and valleys in all directions during the summer were like ocean waves of green. So it was really pretty country. And because hills and valleys were such a part of our life when we were in that area, Richland County, there were all of them were named. From my place, you had, where I was raised, you had west, you go down the Mick Hill, if you would, right, and a quarter mile, turn to your, went east, turn to the right, quarter of a mile, you go down the Dix Hill. If you went straight all the way out, then you would go down the Palms Hill. Valleys are more likely to take their names from the landscape features. We had a snow valley, and we had a wheat hollow, and a bear valley, in that area. And streams also had their names, Little Willow, and Upper Buck Creek, and the Lower Buck Creek, and of course Pine River that you probably have already heard of there. Incidentally, my grand that you saw there, he was raised on the south branch of Buck Creek. That's where he was born. My granny that you saw in Haddam, she was raised on the north branch of Buck Creek. Their lives converged in marriage. They went up each of their valleys, settled on the ridge on the farm that was homesteaded by Isaac Johnson, who was my Granny Jones's father. I was born and raised there. The only water that I saw up on the ridge was when we were going to town, and we'd be going down the Mick Hill along the north branch of Buck Creek. That Mick Hill filled largely into my life. What my mother would do toward the end of summer, she'd send me down that hill with a folded paper grocery bag. Bottom of the hill, I'd climb the fence by the driven pipe well that fed the stock gate with water. I'd climb up the pasture hill. On top of that was an old heirloom, unsprayed apple orchard right next to the fields. I'd fill the bag with apples, go back down, and climbing the hill, I would be eating one of the visions of the first apple pie of the summer, dancing in my head. They are some of the best pies that you can eat. The Big Hill played a large part in the ridge culture also. Country roads back at that time all had steep banks, and they bristled with brush, and it didn't take much snow at all before the wind could blow a drift across the roads. Of course, now the banks are all cleared back, and that theoretically doesn't happen anymore. At any rate, more than once in the middle of the night, we would hear this knocking on the front door. And my father would go put on his breeches and go answer and see who was out there. And it would be some guy, staggering guy who had spent a night in Hub City and on the way home and slid on the slippery road. Could my dad possibly come down and pull him up the hill? So my father would finish getting dressed and put on his hat and gloves and boots and all that stuff, load the machine, get a log chain, and then with this guy riding on the fender, go down and pull the tractor up. Sometimes when that happened, the motorist would open his wallet, but more often the wallet had already been emptied in Hub City. This is a little village that had a church and a gas station, maybe, and about 6 taverns. Popular spot if you've ever been there. Well, further north, this is another Big Hill story. Further north of our house was where Don Armstrong, who was an elderly farmer with milking 12 cows, he was kind of retiring from milking, but he was still going strong, drinking beer. He and his wife, Tilly, who was a memorable character, she always dressed in black and had a wide brimmed black hat. What they would do in the wintertime, often in the afternoon, they would drive to a tavern, most often Hub City. That was expensive time. And then on this particular instance, later in the afternoon, they were driving up the Big Hill, and the tractor and the car suddenly spun out on the ice. And Armstrong was so busy concentrating, and a little bit inebriated, concentrating as he was driving. He didn't notice when his elderly wife opened the door to the car and got out, and it was her intent to walk around and push. But at any rate, just as she got out of the car, the wheels gained some traction and made it up the hill. Well, as the story continues, he was sitting bleary-eyed at the kitchen table, waiting for his supper to be served, when suddenly the outside door opened and Tilly came walking in. Oh, he said, finally realizing what had happened. I wondered who that old woman was I saw in my rear view mirror walking up the hill. This is another Little Red Rocker story. It has a little bit of naughty language, so if you were offended by this right away, now is the time to plug your ears. Here we go. This winter Big Hill story took place 100 years ago. My father, that you all saw in the pictures there, was only 3 years old. My grandpa and Granny Jones had taken their cart horse Maud, hitched to a cutter, which is a sled, for an all-day trip into town, 20-mile trip there. When they were in town, their goal had been to buy this little red rocking chair for my 3-year-old father as a Christmas present. They also bought him a paper bag full of jelly beans. Well, they were almost home. Darkness was falling on the Big Hill. Jimmy was sitting in his rocking chair on the bed of the cutter, rocking and eating his jelly beans, when old Maud hit adrift obliquely and tipped over the cutter. And everyone and everything fell into the snow. But snow's soft, brushes off, nobody was hurt. Afterward, my parents, who were good people, but they were a little salty of speech, and that kind of affected the way that the little boy talked also. At any rate, my grandparents, they were very good people. They were good people. But at any rate, they would encourage little Jimmy to tell the story of the overturned cutter, knowing that when he got to the end of the story, he would always get a laugh, because he would always end with a frown on his face. So he'd say, "Poor damn bitch spilled my jelly beans." Sorry about that. The little red rocker sits very innocently now in front of our fireplace in our house in Platteville, and I treasure that. That will probably be one of the last things that I ever part with. But enough winter stories. I think we're all ready for spring and to think about summer. So I got one that has no snow on the road in the story. Two of my happy memories involve hay. And if you're from the farm, you remember the early days of haying before bales were the size of a small building. What I remember is sitting on the hay rack, empty hay rack, my legs dangling over the side, my fingers in the grooves between the boards, and holding my head back, enjoying the breeze as my father would take the tractor out of gear and gravity would accelerate the trip. That was pretty, I felt like I was flying. That was a small thing, but when you're a farm kid, that was a big deal. The other vivid image I have is of summer picnic breaks under the 4 pine trees in the lawn. Making hay was a long, arduous process. And midway between the noon dinner, that's when we ate dinner, not at the evening, and the evening supper, we would have a picnic break on the blanket. My mother would make white bread summer sausage sandwiches and bring out cookies she'd made, usually chocolate chip cookies with hickory nuts we picked up in the pasture. Pitcher of iced tea for the grown-ups and Kool-Aid for the kids. My Uncle Vern, you saw him in the uniform, and my grand would join us, and we'd sit down in a blanket and enjoy the cool rest until it was finally time to go back into the hot fields and the even hotter haymow. I loved hay when I was a child. I could just barely remember the loose hay. When you saw my father on the load of hay that he loaded, I don't have real clear memories of all of that, but I do have good memories of when my father went mechanically upscale and he purchased a used Alice Chalmers round baler. It was a bulky thing, and it just almost exhausted this entire vocabulary of swear words maintaining that thing that never worked more than about half of the time. But I have memories of when we would pick up the bales. I was old enough to drive the tractor on a flatbed wagon, and my father would wear chamois gloves and bale hooks. You're nodding your head. Some of you remember those bales that they would load. And when I would be driving the tractor, I would spot 4-leaf clovers. That's one of the many talents I have that make me absolutely no money at all. And I would spot them, and I would point, and my very patient uncle would go pick the 4-leaf clovers. We'd get it on him. And by the time we had the hay loaded, I would have a fistful of 4-leaf clovers. When I got back to the home place, I put them in a jelly glass in water until later when I had time to press them in the pages of an encyclopedia. And when they were dry, I would tape them in scrapbooks. I actually had hundreds of those. I won a prize at the fair for a collection because of all of my 4-leaf clovers. You know, at the time, I never. Thank you.
All right, I'll do your best.
they're kind of like one of those collie, shepherd collies that move sheep around. Next time I'll go, bah, why did you tell me to do that? But at any rate, I never thought that they actually brought me good luck. But in retrospect, looking back, I think maybe in a way they did. I once heard an old farmer say that of all the things that you could raise on a farm, the best thing that you could raise is children. I think some of you might agree with that. But at any rate, as an adult, looking back, I've always had twinges. Well, I knew from the time that I was a little kid I wanted to be a teacher rather than a farmer. But as an adult, I always had twinges of guilt looking back to the fact that I left the farm. It had belonged to my great-grandfather, and I'm the last of the family to be there. But I assuaged my guilt by eventually buying half of the farm. I bought just the woodland and the cropland. So in a sense, I guess it depends on how you look at me. You might see me as an absentee landlord or a gentleman farmer. I'm probably more of an absentee landlord, but it's nice to have that land. We're going to move from. We're going to move from the ridge to the valley in this story. As a kid, I felt that by nature I really should have been a child of the valley and creeks. I felt I'd been misplaced on the ridge in many respects, and that thought kind of persists to today. My wife feels differently. She prefers valleys she prefers hills to valleys, other way around, thank you. Despite that disagreement, we're now approaching our 60th wedding anniversary, so we've kind of worked that out over the past. But at any rate, our small dairy farm was perched, high on Pleasant Ridge. We had an old windmill that stuck up in the air to catch any wind that blew from any direction and pump water. Panoramic view in all directions up there, very scenic. But on gale force days, I sometimes thought that when I crossed from the house to the barn, that maybe I should put rocks in my pocket as ballast. I felt especially vulnerable to the blizzards of winter, the driving rains of spring, the scorching sun of summer, the rare tornadoes of fall, and always the wind. I envied Ethel Brewer's house. It was situated at the beginning of the upper Buck Creek Valley, the foot of the Dix Hill down from our farm on the ridge. The white frame building featured this most miraculous of architectural features from my perspective as a child, a double porch that was screened in. And when you were on it, you had a contemplative view of the grassy lawn that extended down to the road. And across that, a creek, and the dairy cattle would be eating grass in the pasture that led up to the fence line. And beside the house, there was this huge willow tree, and below it was a spring that trickled into a brook that eventually joined the creek. It's a wonderful place. Her parents had owned the farm before her. Ethel was she was a sweet lady. But to be honest, in some ways she looked a bit like a crone. Her teeth were less than perfect. Her skin was kind of a sallow color. And she had salt and pepper hair that frizzed around her shoulders. When you saw her, it was easy to imagine her kind of hunkered over a cauldron, dropping in frogs and toadstools, muttering incantations, but she wasn't a witch. She was really, really a sweet, sweet lady. Um, her laughter may have been a cackle, but her eyes were squinted in mirth, and sometimes she would be so amused by something that she would actually stagger trying to keep her balance. She was that kind of a person. But the only magic spells that she cast were in her lawn. Through the magic of mail order catalog, she ordered exotic cultivars that she would plant. And her doorstep, I mean, she transformed what was ordinarily a utilitarian sort of farm dooryard. It was like a botanical garden. But the most amazing thing that she did, that I defy you to come up with anybody in your farm experience who did something like this. She ordered fertile peacock eggs from a postal source, and she slipped them under an unsuspecting setting hen. But we all know the story of the ugly duckling, that became a swan. Can you imagine this hen's surprise when she hatched these creatures, that looked like they were feathered for some sort of Las Vegas review of showbirds or something of that sort. But the peacocks wandered, this botanical garden, and it almost could have been the English Kew Royal Botanical Gardens, but it wasn't. It was in the Driftless area, Pleasant Ridge. The cry of the peacock has become fabled in literature. Have any of you heard of peacock?
Yes.
When you hear that, it's not a songbird. Not at all. It's many times compared to a woman's scream. People say, on still foggy days when we were up on the ridge, she was down in the valley, sometimes we could hear those peacocks, the sound coming clear up there. And while it's not exactly like the shriek of a woman who's being attacked in the woods, it sure doesn't sound like the clucking of a contented Rhode Island redhead, if you've heard it. Well, at any rate, the many shrubs and perennials that Ethel had in her lawn added to the feeling of kind of romantic mystery, with the peacocks and everything. A lot of us had maybe a lilac or maybe a bridal wreath or something like that. But most of us didn't recognize the stuff that she had growing in her lawn at all. But I didn't care, because when I was in her lawn, I wasn't up on the ridge. I was nestled in a valley, in a garden of Eden, without the startling interruptions of a snake or native people. Only a grove of apple trees behind the house on the dairy farm that she called Apple Lawn, which is a nice name for a farm, I think. I could shortcut to side story here. I could shortcut to Ethel's house down the valley. There was an old style. Do you know what I mean by those? They're kind of like a stepladder with two steps that my father and uncle, when they were boys, used to climb over the fence on the way to the Upper Buckford School that was on the Dix Hill just before you got to the old Dix place there. The steps were perpetually mossy and damp when I would walk on them, but I enjoyed those. What has happened now, as you would expect? The old Dix place is completely gone. So many buildings are now. Style of the fence, that's decayed as well. There used to be if you know the Driftless area where there are ridges and valleys, you know that the valley farmers would have a ridge road to get up to the fields. Well, there used to be a ridge road there too, but it's completely eroded now. And even if it were, it's far too narrow for any of the implements that people would use today. They go all the way around on the roads and get there, prefer that. I have a lot of good memories of Pleasant Ridge. I have one, too, that is kind of amusing. I showed some of you this before. Whoa, it's okay. Oh. This is Steve Bryant in the picture. He's this scrawny, shaggy-looking guy. This is his wife, Hattie, and his daughter, Kitty Mae. They're wearing those flower sack dresses. Well, this is part of my extended family, which who's shaking her head. I wonder why. My wife. What did it? My uncle, my great uncle Cal, my granny's brother, was very, very briefly married to Kitty Mae. But that's a story in itself. We'll save for another time. If you want to see this close up, you could look at that and pass that along. Other parts of the country may have had a Paul Bunyan or Pecos Bill. You've heard of them. Well, on Pleasant Ridge, we had Steve Bryant pictured there. One time, Steve was driving his horses into town down the Hicks Hill, an all-day trip. From there, it was still 10 miles each way. On his way home, when he was coming up the Hicks Hill, there was a cloud burst that just, it not only did it wet Steve, but it dampened the harness, the leather traces, they were wet. And as you know, when leather is wet, it stretches. And what happened is the horses continued plodding up the hill, but the wagon just sat there as the harnesses stretched. And Steve was a patient man. Eventually the sun came out and it dried the harnesses, and as they dried, the wagon started jingling up the hill. And by the time that the horses reached the very top of the hill, Steve had joined them. But in this process, what had happened is that there was a can of kerosene in the wagon, and it sloshed a little bit. And Steve had put hay in the wagon to feed the horses when they got in town before their return trip. There was still a little hay left, and it splashed onto that hay. Well, Steve, was kind of, didn't want to waste not kind of guy, and he thought, well, by the time he unhitched the horses, the kerosene probably had pretty much evaporated, be okay. So he just forked it into the manger with for the horses, and eventually they ate it. Well, Steve found out that it made the hard way, that it made them a little gassy. It's when he walked into the barn in the morning, he lit his pipe, and the explosion blew it clean out the door. Luckily, no harm was done otherwise. That's Steve Bryant. More of Steve's true stories are in my book, but I would warn you that one of them is a bit racy, and the others are decidedly in poor taste. But that could be the ridge. The final piece I'm going to share with you now is not in my book. I used to be a school teacher, and I never stood in one place. I wandered around, and it's hard for me to have forbidden spots, if you wouldn't mind. Sorry about that. But at any rate, this piece is not in my book, but I think that for all the rich stories that I've written, published and unpublished, that this one serves as kind of an epilogue for all of them. And, so it's called Yard Lights. I'm sure if you were raised on a farm, you remember yard lights. During my boyhood, stars filled the heavens on clear nights, and had I been a student of constellations, I could have examined the spectacular display of them above me, as we were free of any light pollution in Pleasant Ridge at that time. But while I could easily spot the Big Dipper, I lacked the imagination and information to identify others, and my father was no help to me in that realm at all. When I stood in our driveway, and if I turned 365 degrees, I saw distant lights in every direction, as if stars had fallen from the heavens, but kept burning brightly. Some of the lights were houses, but more often the rows of barn windows, as milking generally lasted into the evening, especially fall and winter. But most vivid of all were yard lights, mounted on utility poles to illuminate the way between the house and the barn. If lighted windows in houses and barns were stars, yard lights were the planet. Sorry about that. Start over. If lighted windows in houses and barns were the stars, yard lights were the planets, the darkness of the landscape like a mirror reflecting the sky above. When my father and I had finished milking, we turned off the lights in the barn and walked to the well-lit house, our way illuminated by the yard light. He could point out the lights of our neighborhood, Bunker Hill, the settlement, the north consisting of little more than a tavern, a church, and a grade school, and old country small-time villages, the essentials there. He could identify farms in every direction too, as if he were a country astrologer, and to each constellation of landscape lights he could attribute either virtues or sometimes shortcomings. But they were all part of the neighborhood. While each farm was in a sense an isolated entity, the network of lights united them. I think of old movies that I've seen of the Civil War, where a hillside would be dotted with campfires. Soldiers were separated by space, but they were united by purpose. And I remember the letters of John Clark Davis, my Granny Jones, as you saw her picture, maternal grandfather, a Civil War soldier who returned to his wife and daughters in a small farm on the North Branch of Buck Creek after the Great War. Unlike many of his fellow soldiers, he was a survivor. I recall Grant Jones, who was a World War I doughboy who escaped both artillery and influenza. But his farming career was severely compromised by emphysema, and we always wondered if he'd gotten a whiff of mustard gas at some time during his service. And I have memories of the stories of Cousin Vern Johnson, a World War II bomber pilot who dropped bombs in Italy and then came safely home. Milk cows, plant crops. And I think of Uncle Vern, who was drafted at the tail end of the war, but was safely ensconced in an office job, as was I. I was drafted during the Vietnam conflict. But I managed to land on my feet, obviously. And Uncle Vern returned to his farm, where he still lives. And this June, he will be 98 years old. And as I told you before, I now laugh at half of the acreage of my father's farm, so I guess I'm kind of a farmer of sorts, in a pathetic sort of way. Now, I have lived in cities and towns where darkness never falls completely. Urban streets and highways always lit, never empty. City visitors to our summer place in the country sometimes are intimidated by the unfamiliar darkness, but I've always moved securely through the night. Sometimes yard lights serving as beacons. And now when I remember yard lights, I think of the souls of farmers. Not only those agrarians who were forced to pound their plowshares metaphorically into swords and go off and fight. But those far from the madding crowds of noble strife, agrarians who stayed on the farm where they were born. Incandescent lights were the metaphorical campfires during my youth, unlike the mercury vapor successors that had their blue sort of industrial light. The old-fashioned light bulbs not only provided a sense of hearth for families living in the halo, within the halo of their light, but they signaled to neighboring farms, you are not alone. We are here too. We are a community, and the rays of light that connect us over the distance are powerful bonds that keep us safe through the night and remind us that in the morning the sun will again rise, and that despite falling farm prices, the threat of farm foreclosures, and the worry that the oldest son might not take over the land, that we have answered an agricultural call that is primal, that reflects the spirit of our nation's founding, that feeds our country's people, and that above all else is a lifestyle that not only endures, but prevails. Thank you. Now, I've come to an end of my rich stories. If you have any questions that you would like to ask me, or if you have any stories that you want to share. Yes?
It's just a story. My cousin lived on a farm. Her and her husband, for some reason or another, they had peacocks.
Really?
Oh,
I wonder if they knew Ethel Brewer.
pardon?
If they knew my neighbor in the valley, if they knew her. I would probably not.
No.
Yeah. Well, that's something.
I can't remember where they're from. They're from Janesville, but it's up around from where I was, and I can't remember all the towns and stuff, but they used to have peacocks, beautiful feathers.
Yes.
They would go out in the morning. Irene would go to feed the peacocks, and she'd look for them. They'd be on top of the barn, and then they'd go and yell. It sounds like, "Help me, help me!"
Yeah. Well, what Ethel would do is that she would gather the peacock feathers and she would arrange them in vases in her house. You know, is something that is beautiful.
Oh, they're pretty.
They are. Yes.
Are you familiar with Ben Logan?
Of
And the
course.
Land Remembers?
Yes,
You
yes.
just reminded me of him.
Oh, I thank you. I am very flattered. That's the kindest thing you could say. It's
Did
yeah,
he
it's-
live near you?
in a general area. How far was that? Like Viroqua, which would be north, I think so. I'm not sure. If it's Viroqua, it'd be north of Richland Center.
Hidden Valley was the name of the farm.
Yeah, we read that years, we both read that years and years ago in paperback, and not long ago we were someplace, it may have been a resale shop or something, and we saw what was an anniversary version of his book that was filled with pictures. And that was, his language is such that you hardly need pictures, but it was nice.
It's one of the best books I've ever read.
It is really very good. It is
Land
poignant.
Remembers.
Yes, and it so much captures the spirit. When I was I taught for many years in Gibraltar High School in northern Door County, if you know where Door County is. And that's the school, other than Washington Island, that's farthest up the peninsula. And there was another school that was further down that was Sebastopol, and then you go down to southern Door. And what happened with farming in northern Door is that the farmers who owned land were tremendously wealthy from the land they owned, but they couldn't make a nickel on it unless they sold it. You know, because it wasn't good farmland sort of thing. And some of the students I had, they were dear sweet kids, and I loved them. But they would make fun of the farm kids that were further down the peninsula. I didn't listen to that silently. I didn't. growl and, pound on them or anything like that, but I pointed out the dignity and the nurturing aspect of farmers and how that is really an important thing. I mean, it takes a real man to walk into a barn and roll up his sleeves and help a cow deliver a calf. And that's the sort of nurturing that you see with farmers. Yes?
What did you teach? What subjects?
Well, the most important subject you could teach. I taught English,
That's what I thought.
literature, and writing. Is there any question at all? Yeah, I loved being a teacher. I went through a sort of a career crisis when I was about 40 because I had graduate degrees and stuff. And everyone else who had them was making a lot of money and I wasn't. But then I realized that people told me I was a good teacher and I really liked teaching. And I never for a moment felt that I was wasting my time. It was a wonderful life. Yes?
According to what you said in one overview that you taught, you started teaching at Western High School?
I started teaching at Weston High School. Do you know Weston?
Yes, I'm a graduate of 1966.
From Weston?
Yes.
In 1966? Oh my God. You missed probably having me as a teacher by 1 year. Because I started in 66, but I taught freshmen and juniors. So you may have been there. I don't know if you remember me. I hope you know my freshman year was not my best year of teaching. Here is what happened to me. I have to tell you this story. I had when I was teaching in Door County, years and years past, I started teaching there in 1981, and there was a woman, and was her maiden name Durham? Durham. I think her maiden name was Durham. That first year I had a junior class at the end of the day. And I don't know who was worst as far as behavior, my teaching or their learning. I was not a good teacher. She's a sweet lady, but I think she at that point may not have been a good teacher either. But at any rate, when it happened, Gibraltar was having a homecoming parade, and a bunch of us were standing there, and her married name was not Durham, so I hadn't recognized that. But at any rate, we found out that she had been my student, at Weston High School. And once we made that realization, neither of us had a word to say. We were just quiet, hoping the subject would be changed. But one of the things that I liked about Weston High School is I liked the kids. There was, and one of the things I would tell Lou about this too is that when I had the freshmen, the thing that was amusing is a lot of the freshmen were, and I don't intend this as critical at all, they were like little old men in a way. They were short and small, and a lot of them had that sort of a seriousness, at least in my class.
90% of us were all farmers.
For farmers, yes. Well, I got the job because my parents, had been farmers. They had gone to the Evangelical United Brethren Church that was near where we lived, and it was closed, and they had to go to church someplace, so they went to Lime Ridge, and they met people from Casadonia and this sort of thing.
I know all of the towns in my area.
Yeah, but at any rate, what happened then is that I never had to apply for a teaching job. The people in that community knew that I was going to be graduating. They needed an English teacher, and they contacted me and wanted. So I didn't have to interview and had a job. So it was good for me, especially at the time. We lived in Reedsburg. It was good. Yeah. So where did you live?
I don't know if you remember or anything like that. I live just south of Hill Point.
Okay, sure, I know. My parents would go eat fish at Hill Point.
Yep.
So I know generally where that is. So when did you?
Village Inn?
Pardon?
Like the Village Inn?
Probably. I don't remember that, but I would guess. Yeah. So you're obviously not there now, or did you travel all the way from High Point to here?
Now,
Yeah,
I left that area in 1976.
did you? Yeah, I left it in 1968, and we were going to move to Madison. I had a teaching job there, and was going to begin work on a master's degree. And the Richland County Draft Board decided he ain't worth any sort of a deferment anymore. He changed his job. He's not essential, and I became a soldier. But then, as a result of that, I had veterans benefits that I spent. Anybody else? Yes?
We traveled up to Viola for a funeral one time, and the food at the potluck was phenomenal.
Yeah?
None of it healthy. It was all.
Now, if you pick your funerals right, you eat well. You know,
Yeah.
my wife has some family members who have had incredible funeral lunches. You know, it helps with grief a lot. You know, I think. Yes.
You're talking about Viola. I grew up in Viola, so I still have a whole bunch of people that Sarge, Viola, around those areas. And I grew up, you were just mentioning towns like that, and I was about to say that's where I'm from. My brother and my two sisters went to a country school. I never did.
Yeah.
But, they got stories. You had country schools on there, right? One time when my sister went to a country school, my dad had a very weird name. His name was Myron Ursel Poet, and the teacher said, write on the paper what your dad's name is. Myron Ursel Pellet. There's no such a name. And she said, ask for Dad.
Well, one-room schools were really wonderful. I went, in many ways, I went all of my 8 years to a one-room school. But the thing is, what's the strength of a one-room school is the family-like atmosphere, you know, with a teacher. It's real easy when you're teaching, when you're in a one-room school, to mistakenly call your teacher mom for obvious reasons. You're going to be incredibly embarrassed that you've done that. But a lot of what you learn in one-room school is not necessarily academic. You know, it's other sorts of things that you learn that are important. Well, you guys have things to do, places to go, people to meet, and all that sort of thing. So I thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. It's been fun for me.